100 years ago, in the spring of 1921, the World Championship match between Jose Raul Capablanca and Emmanuel Lasker took place in Havana. And I'd like to mark that occasion by looking at some of the key games in that match. Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Help me get to 100,000 subscribers. There's some great stuff on this channel, so let's get there together. I'd be very grateful. So here we go. I'm looking at game 5 of this match. They'd had 4 very closely contested games up to this point. So in this game, Capablanca is white, Lasker is of course black, and it's a Queen's Gambit decline. So this little mini series combines very happily with my series on how to play the Queen's Gambit. And I will go back at the end of this game and just go over some of the theory in more detail. But for the moment, I think all you need to do is to understand that this is one of the main lines of the Queen's Gambit. Black is holding that pawn on d5, supporting it with the pawn on e6, and has this nice pawn chain. And the reason I've always enjoyed playing the Queen's Gambit declined as black is because black castles very early. And basically, you just don't need to worry about your king. And then you can concentrate on the center and on developing your other pieces. So yeah, this is game 5. This was a tough match for Lasker, of course. He was 52 years old. Capablanca was 20 years younger. In fact, Lasker basically originally didn't want to contest this match. He'd been world champion for a very long time already, 21 years. And he actually resigned his world title. But he was persuaded to play this match by supporters, and well, some supporters of Capablanca had found a very nice prize fund, and frankly Lasker after World War I was pretty much broke, so well, a decent payday suited him, and well, many people in the chess world simply wanted to see this match take place actually. But it wasn't easy for Lasker. You know, he was playing in a tropical climate of Havana, which he wasn't used to. And of course, yeah, Capablanca was the coming man. So Lasker plays b6. Well, such a typical move in these Queen's Gambit positions where you bring your bishop to this long diagonal. Whoops, that long diagonal, there you go. I'm misfiring with my arrows already. And Capablanca exchanges. Now, normally in this kind of positions, you actually want to play knight takes here. But this isn't possible in this position because of the rook on c1. Black loses a pawn. So black recaptures with the pawn, which is still okay. Now, as I said, I will return to this position at the end to check out the theory in more detail. But I think we can say that this idea of Queen A4 that Capablanca played is very risky. And now he goes in for this pawn grab with Queen C6. And to my eyes, this is incredibly risky and so uncharacteristic of Capablanca. So let's see what happens. The Queen attacks the rook. Rook B8. And he takes this pawn. But, you know, in taking this pawn, it's really risky. The king is still in the middle. Black is actually pretty well developed. And actually, this is a key moment in the game. Lasker plays, maybe you could say, an obvious move. Bishop B7. Maybe there's a better move there. I'll show you at the end of the game. So that forces this knight to take the bishop. And the queen comes out again. So after that little transaction, white's still a pawn up, but black is so well coordinated here. Rooks are connected, we like that very much. The queen is active, this bishop is looking great. So how do we start an attack on white's king? I mean, I think there are quite a few good moves here. You could already damage the pawns on the king side with bishop takes. Pawn takes pawn is probably pretty good. Not a bad idea with simply this idea. And then g5, and we can take that pawn. I mean, this is just a very unclear position. You can see those rooks are split, which isn't too clever. But then again, you know, maybe black has weakened his king side a bit here. Lots of interesting moves. The move that Lasker played, rook c8, it's basically aimed at exchanging on d4 and getting in on the c file, so that's pretty dangerous. But Capa comes up with a good defensive move. Queen to a3, pinning this pawn. And here, once again, it looks very attractive to take here. But Lasker plays queen e6 first. I can sort of understand why he wanted to keep that tremendous bishop in reserve. Bishop takes, queen takes. And Capablanca plays bishop a6. He has to get his pieces out. He has to trade pieces. Otherwise, black's initiative is just going to be too strong. Bishop takes knight. So this is an exchange sacrifice from Lasker. Bishop takes rook, rook takes, and pawn takes, queen takes pawn. So, well, it's even pawns, but black is simply the exchange down. But then again, you can see that white is unable to castle. Those rooks are split. That's very unfortunate. And black, you know, has quite an initiative here. So, tricky position all around. I'd say decent compensation for the exchange. Queen comes back. Now, this is a very important move. Pawn to g6. At some moment, the rook is going to have to come up the board, and the king needs an escape square. King f1. King steps to the side, and rook e4. And here, Capa plays what to me looks like a very understandable move. Black's queen is in a great position, so he wants to drive it away with queen d1. Computers think this is a better move, but I think queen d1 looks like a very human move to me. But after this check, of course, white doesn't want to exchange queens, but after this check, this is not so clear now. You know, this is a slightly awkward pin to deal with. Lasker, whoops, I've leapt ahead again. Excuse me. Lasker played here knight f6, but it's even better to play here. Now, some people thought that rook c4 would be a good move here. But actually black has tremendous compensation after this move. And that knight comes in on f3. Now that is pretty much an octopus knight. There you go. That's a cue for my octopus knight mug to appear. What a beautiful piece. You know, white is struggling a bit here. I mean, black can equalise immediately by playing this, and the king and pawn endgame after the exchanges here should be a draw. And after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, that's a much better version of the game for black. Black has tremendous compensation once that knight reaches here. Anyway, Lasker played knight f6, king g1, just stepping out of the pin. Pawn takes pawn, and here, well, again, if pawn takes pawn, then knight d5. That's really good compensation for black. Just superb coordination for black there. I think Lasker would... Well, I mean, I'm not going to say that black is definitively better, but it's certainly a much easier position for Lasker to play than Capablanca. But Capa, after this move, pawn takes pawn, played a good move. Rook c4. So he's prepared to give up a pawn if he can exchange pieces. That is crucial. So check. Check. That pushes the knight back, of course, because the knight is attacked. And now here's an interesting moment. How would you recapture that pawn? Just have a little think. What's the best way? Somehow one might think that after queen takes e3 that's the best. But queen f5, still decent compensation for black. Queen maybe looking to come down here. If that knight can get to f4, that would be a very fine thing. Pawn takes pawn is the better move, because then the rook can shuffle across and exploit this pin, like so. And that's difficult for black to get out of. Now, it's kind of a moot point, but if black sits there, well, only white can do something, but I mean, maybe if black sits there, you start advancing this pawn to a6. That's a possibility. In any case, it would be very dangerous to play so passively. Lasker decided he wanted to step out of the pin, making room for the king. But now h4 starts to open up the position. If h6, then you play h5. That king can never get out of the pin. So Lasker took on h4. He could also have played king g6. It's a very, very complicated position. And both kings are pretty insecure here. h5 holds on to the knight. Well, here Capablanca repeated the position a couple of times. Now checking again would be a threefold repetition and a draw. So this was a crunch moment. I should say that the time control was 30 moves in 2 hours. So very slow compared to classical time controls nowadays. And actually, I don't know if that helped Lasker. Lasker was really fatigued in this match, and the long time control meant really long games. Very tough for him. But in any case, here Capablanca did not play the best move with white. Annotating this game in his book My Great Predecessors, Kasparov thought that queen takes pawn should be a win. But this is quite scary. White's king is really open here. I think the key thing is that this mate is threatened as well as the knight, so the knight has to go back. But still, I can understand why Kappa was reluctant to go in for this. I mean, Kasparov ends the variation here and says white should win. Well, maybe. Still very tricky. I think a really practical move here for white is to play queen f4, which keeps black tied to the f7 pawn. Also guards the e3 pawn. These endgames, well, let's just assume they're going to be winning for white. So yeah, queen f4 is the move, I think. Let's just get the paint off the board. That's best for white, actually, or a very practical move. b3 is a kind of tidy move. But Lasker now played queen d6. Excellent idea. Looking at g3, looking at the check here. Queen f4, check. Queen came back. And this is not simple now. Rook takes pawn, knight takes. White's king is quite exposed. Now some checks. Queen b7. And now here, I leave it up to you. How would you play in this position if you had black? You've got 15 minutes. 15 minutes to make your next move. According to Lasker, that's how long he had for this move. So he wasn't in time pressure as such. But it's a long game. They were probably into, let me see, probably into the 5th hour by this point. Certainly not an easy position when you've been playing for such a long time in the heat of Havana. So where would you put that king? You've got options. Where should it go? Well, in fact, if you wanted to play any of these moves, f6, e6 or d6, then black is still okay. Unfortunately, Lasker put his king backwards. And after queen b8, he had to resign. Tragedy. If the king steps up, then obviously this exchange wins the knight here. Double attack. And if the king goes to g7, we've got a check. The king comes here, and we don't even need to bother with the queen. We play queen h6 mate. Tragedy for Lasker, who'd fought so hard in that game. Really such a difficult position for both sides to play. Pity. He was obviously fatigued at the end of the game. Let's go back and look at some theory. This is Queen's Gambit main line with rook c1. And here you could say the orthodox move is to play c6. That was a favourite of Capablanca's. We've already looked at a game of Alekhine, well, Capablanca-Alekhine from their 1927 match, where a6 was played by Alekhine. Also a very sound move with the idea of taking and then playing b5, bishop b7 and c5. So b6 is a little bit different and is similar to the Tartakova variation. So black wants to put the bishop here. But this pawn exchange means you can't, as I said earlier, you can't recapture with the knight. And here I think the best for white is to play with bishop d3. And simply play this kind of hanging pawn position. And white can hope to get some pressure on the centre. But it's still a very tricky position. Queen c2 is also potentially an option. You've got to watch out for d4 all the time, though, opening up that bishop. But yeah, it's playable for black, actually. And in game one of their match, Capablanca had played bishop b5 against Lasker, and the game had gone like this. But actually Lasker was absolutely fine. Once again, he'd got these kind of this position with hanging pawns. This is a very good version for black, because there is really no danger at all to these pawns. Well supported by black's pieces. Black is really active there, and Lasker, well, had no difficulty at all in that game, ended in a draw. So this is actually an interesting move, b6. It's certainly not fashionable, but it's quite reasonable for black. It's not as popular as the other moves, but a reasonable move. So there you go. I'll be giving you more news from the Capablanca-Lasker match from 1921 in this little series, and yeah, some more Queen's Gambit theory already. If you haven't checked out the other Queen's Gambit videos, do check out those games. Thanks for watching.